Liu Shanshu, title lost. The path ends here, among white clouds. In spring, as long as this blue creek. Now and then, flowers float past, lending perfume to the flowing water. My quiet gate faces the mountain road. My study is deep among willow trees. Sometimes the sun breaks through this shade, shining in to brighten my faded robe. So, this is a poem by Liu Shanshu. I've seen other transcriptions of his name in other translations. Now, we do not know too much about this author. This is the only poem of his that is included in the anthology. It seems that he was a person from the High Tang period. He passed different examinations, including the presented scholar one and the erudite literatus one, and he served in some post in the central government, but we know very little about him. He had some relations with some High Tang poets like Wan Changling, Meng Haoran, Gao Shi, but after the death of Men Haorang, we have no further information whatsoever about this Liu Shanshu. And in the case of this poem, we don't even preserve the title, although we do not need a title to clarify the topic of the poem, which is pretty transparent, it's crystal clear. So this poem is about the retired life. We've encountered many poems about this. Remember that an ideal for scholar officials was temporarily or permanently to abandon the affairs of state, the tensions of serving in office, of infighting, of cliques, and so on. They always had this wish, which was in contradiction with the Confucian ideology, of retiring from the world and of living the simple life. So this is not only a personal tension within a scholar official, it's also a religious tension, as we've already highlighted in the past, the tension between Confucianism versus Taoism or Buddhism. And there were precedents since at least the period of disunion, if not earlier, probably even earlier, of scholar officials who, because of the corruption of the world or the lack of recognition that they had gotten, clearly decided to steer a path away from serving in office, even when they could serve in office. And the giant figure here, the referent, is always Tao Juangming from the period of disunion. And these poems about the retired life, generally they follow the same standard procedure. They generally describe a simple life in which the scholar official does not live in what we would call poverty, but he does live in a certain modesty of abode and of dress and of consumption and pleasures. Yeah? It's a simple life in which the scholar official may theoretically, probably more theoretically than in practice, work his own fields, or at least be occupied with management of a moderately small land holding. He lives in a poor house, with a rustic house, far away from the capital, with rustic materials. He doesn't wear flashy or expensive clothes, and he dedicates his free time mostly at reading or at appreciating nature. Now, up to a point, this poetry of the retired life merges sometimes with the eremitic or ascetic life, which is not exactly the same. So, for example, Tao Juangming lived the life of a retired scholar official, but he didn't live the life of a hermit. He wasn't a religious practitioner in the sense of going off into the mountains to live through ascetic and religious practices, the religious life. But the frontiers between one and the other do get diffuminated in that many of these country retreats of the scholar officials, or the places where they went when they retired, did locate themselves in mountains and other places of religious worship, and sometimes the scholar officials did occupy a lot of their retired time with religious pursuits. Anyway, so we were saying the topic of this poem very clearly is the retired life, and it includes an element of landscape description. You could say the poem has two parts. The first two couplets put the emphasis on describing the surroundings of the house, the mountain house of the poet writing the poem. And of course, it's a nature landscape of mountains and rivers, and with lots of indications of renouncing the world. We will comment on that when we go into each of the couplets. The second part, which is the last two couplets, focuses or zooms in into the house itself and the life of the scholar, of the retired scholar official in the house. Okay, then let's go as usual, couplet by couplet. The path here ends among white clouds. In spring, as long as this blue creek. So, as usually happens in Chinese poetry, we could try to sieve two different meanings, the literal and the metaphorical, from this couplet. The couplet seems to be describing a path, probably the path leading to the mountain home of the poet. And it says, this is the path. It ends here among white clouds, so it's probably high in the mountains, which would explain why the path seems to disappear amidst clouds and mist. In spring, which is a misty time of year where lots of mists gather up. And the path is described as long as this blue creek. So we're supposed to imagine or to visualize a little rivulet going parallel to or next to the path. So, this could be purely descriptive, but it's very easy to for example, to remember that the word for path in Chinese, Dao, is also used for the road to enlightenment. It's the way with capital W, the way to truth, the way to enlightenment. So the path here ends among white clouds. So it goes up. White clouds are very frequently a symbol of hermits, of wandering scholar officials, of the retired life. That is, hermits, Taoist sages, Buddhist monks live in the mountains, surrounded by white clouds. They are like white clouds themselves, unattached to the world and floating away and drifting around. Second couplet. Now and then, flowers float past, lending perfume to the flowing water. We're in spring. That has already been established in the first couplet. And we get a description. There was a rivulet, a blue creek, floating next to the path, and sometimes flowers float on the path and give it perfume. So it's a lovely natural image. But again, very easy perhaps to scratch and find some references, or at least parallelisms with classical images. You will remember Peach Blossom Spring, which is a short story written by Tao Juangming, of which we've talked in the past, in which a fisherman encounters a river next to some peach blossom trees. So the peach trees, and the river covered with peach blossoms. He follows the river to its source and encounters an ideal retreat disconnected from the world, where people have lived since hundreds of years back, away from the state. It's not clear if the people living there are just happy, long-lived people or immortals in some way or other. But anyway, the idea is the utopian community that managed to excise itself from the corruption and the dangers and evolutions of the material world. So these flowers floating on the river seem to be evoking Peach Blossom Spring, that ideal scenario of utopian detachment from the world. Third couplet. As we said, the third and fourth couplets take us from this nature background, this mountain, river and road background, into the more specific lodgings of the poetic persona. My quiet gate faces the mountain road. My study is deep among willow trees. So again, the road that we are following, that path that appeared from line 1, that path that ended among white clouds, that path is a mountain path and seems to lead, or at least pass by, a quiet gate. So the gate is the gate of the home, of the rustic home of the poet. It's described as quiet. We might imagine that not many people visit the poet in his mountain lodgings, so not a lot of traffic. And the study, which is where we might imagine the poet goes to relax, to read, to write, is deep among willow trees. It's surrounded by willow trees in the midst of nature. Again, these two images very, very clearly connect with Tao Juangming, the ideal of the retired scholar official. He also has a poem in which he says something like, the road next to my home has no ruts from chariots and prams. That is, it's like a back alleyway where nobody comes. And one of his nicknames was Mr. Five Willows, because he liked to be surrounded by willows. And in some of his poems, Tao Juangming also says that he planted willows around his house and around his study. So again, I think we're meant to connect this couplet and this rural retreat to Tao Juangming's rural retreat. Finally, conclusion. So this couplet, this third couplet, doesn't go into big details about the house. Well, this is a pentasyllabic regulated poem. It doesn't have that much space as a gushi would have for, detailing and describing the abode of the poet. It just focuses on two places, the gate and the study, but it's enough to, picture in the mind of the reader that sort of rural, rustic place where a scholar official could enjoy the simple pleasures of reading, drinking, and, peaceful life in general. So just as the third couplet focuses on the house, the last couplet focuses on the poet and his clothes. Sometimes the sun breaks through this shade, shining in to brighten my faded robe. So probably while he's in his study, which is shaded by willows, from time to time a ray of sunlight crosses in and brightens up the faded robe of the faded robes, the faded clothes of the poet. So this has many elements of interest. First, light in the darkness. Yeah, even though he's living this modest life, which could be called a dark life, away from glory and fame, a little light seeps in. So this can be literal. Again, he might look out of his window and see a ray of sunlight flowing onto him. It might be symbolic as well. So maybe this ray of light includes the recognition of other people, or maybe the eventual, the occasional, but not a completely non-existent visit of friends who come to appreciate and recognize him. But anyway, even if it's just describing natural phenomena, it's interesting to see how the light brightens the faded robe. Remember, the poet is a retired scholar. He doesn't live in luxury. He lives a modest life. So he won't be wearing luxurious robes and changing them. He's wearing an old robe which is faded from the passage of time, in which the sunlight is, gently brightening up, giving it a lustre and a shine that it lacks in its modesty. But then again, you could say the whole retired life is a form of sun rays shining and brightening up a faded robe. It's the simple pleasures, the light shining in the semi-darkness and illuminating it lightly, that can act as a perfect metaphor, as a perfect symbol for the retired life and its simple pleasures. So, all in all, quite a nice poem. One of the best I've read of late in this collection. I think it very well represents, it very well encapsulates this ideal of the retired life and its conditions.